All right, so now we're moving into Daniel chapter 8. And it's interesting, a lot of people are saying, it seems like as we read through this, it seems like God's repeating himself. And the answer is, a lot of times in prophecy, yes, God is repeating himself. Why? Because it's important. Okay? All throughout Jeremiah, for example, we've said that as we've read the different chapters, God's saying the same thing over and over again. Yeah, he's using different words, he's saying it in different ways, but it's the same message. And the whole point was that message is important. God wants us to understand that this is important. And this is kind of what's happening here in Daniel chapter 8. Now, kind of before we get started, if you got your Bibles, go ahead and head over in that direction. We're going to be starting in verse 1. The interesting thing about prophecies, and this is confusing to the casual Bible reader. Okay, of course, we know nobody in here is just a casual Bible reader, right? You're a Bible studier, okay? And even then, if you're a little bit new at it, occasionally you're going to come across something that's called a type and an antitype in prophecy. What it means is the type is a relatively minor event in history which symbolizes a major event that's going to happen somewhere down the line. Okay? For example, Jesus made a clear example in Luke 4 on the Sabbath day. Okay, let me read it to you. He's in Nazareth. They asked him to read out of the Word, and he reads Isaiah 61, the first two verses, but he doesn't read the whole passage. He stops halfway through verse 2. So when he gets up, he says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to preach good tidings to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to those who are bound, to proclaim this acceptable year of the Lord." Okay? And he stops. And he stops there for a reason, because there's more to this prophecy. And he looks at his audience and he says, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." And of course, this caused a big uproar. All right? What he's talking about, however, because if he goes on, in verse 2, we have to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn. Now, there's a reason why he didn't say that second one, because that wasn't why he came, to wreak vengeance upon the world. Okay? What he said was, I'm here to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord. He's there to begin his earthly ministry, to heal those who need to be healed, to deliver those who need to be delivered. That was the whole point. And this was the type, as they say. This was the type of the prophecy, the first prophecy that preceded a greater fulfillment, or the antitype, which is going to be fulfilled in this passage during his millennial reign. Okay? Now, as I said, people get confused. The Jews were confused by it. Okay? A lot of people look at this and say, wait a minute, why did he stop? Or most people just gloss over it. But those who study prophecy know you're going to find something like this later. Okay? You're going to, look at something and say, and as an example, here in Daniel 8, this is another type of dual prophecy. There is a type, which we're going to go into deeply, and then there's the antitype, which is going to be the Antichrist, by a nice little coincidence in English. All right? And in fact, here's what's fascinating is with this prophecy, because people weren't understanding that there were going to be two fulfillments, people got confused later. For example, Jesus quoted this prophecy in the Olivet Discourse, which is in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. We actually went through this when we went through the book of Luke a while back. And he's talking about the abomination of desolation. He mentions it here in chapter 8, but it's also going to be mentioned again in chapter 9 and 11 of Daniel. Now, if you read this fast, it's obviously clear that something terrible is going to happen in Jerusalem. Okay? And a lot of people read it and say, yeah, he's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. All right? But he goes on from that cannot be explained by history looking solely at the destruction of Jerusalem. Yes, that was part of it, but that was a type, as they say. This was the first part of the fulfillment. There was major tribulation in Jerusalem before Jerusalem fell in AD 70. We don't have time today to go over it. At some point we will. When the Roman armies completely surrounded the city, there was enough food to sustain the population, except for a group of zealots decided to destroy all the food stocks so no one would be tempted to surrender to the Romans. Well, I don't know about you. Logically speaking, that's exactly what would cause someone to surrender to the Romans, because you're starving to death. Okay? Because you destroyed all their food, or all your food, and you want people to die to the last man. Well, that may be so, but you want to survive. Okay? It was horrible. You read about this through Josephus and a lot of other history books of what happened in Jerusalem at that time. The thing is, Christ goes on and talks more, which is going to be talking about the Great Tribulation, which we talked about a bit already. We're going to talk a lot more about it later. Now, the thing was, people who didn't understand this in the early church, and this is how early this misunderstanding took place, because in the early church they didn't understand this. When Jerusalem was destroyed and Christ didn't return, because that's one of the things that showed that this wasn't the complete fulfillment of that prophecy, was that Christ said after these things, the Son of Man returning, okay, that's not the exact words, but that's basically what he said. People said, oh, cool, we see Jerusalem destroyed, Christ is coming back. Okay, let's bring it on. Let's see this is happening, and where's Christ? And a lot of people were disappointed, a lot of people disillusioned. Some turned away from the faith because they figured, Christ didn't keep his word. What's interesting is this was a major point that preceded and actually prompted the church to fall into apostasy in the first century. Okay, not completely. God always keeps a huge faithful following after him, but this is where things started kind of going off the rails. Okay, a lot of stuff that now is very common, for example, in Catholicism, that's where God's roots. Because apparently people figured, hey, we can say anything we want, and everyone's going to believe it as long as we sound like we know what we're talking about. And it's sad. And all it was because a bunch of people didn't understand when they were reading their Bible. Now, not all prophecies are dual. Okay? Some are. Quite a few, in fact, I would probably say most are not. The ones that are dual have to do with God dealing directly with his people in Israel or with the church. The ones that aren't dual tend to be the ones that are dealing with the Gentile nations. For example, the different minor prophets that predicted the fate of ancient cities like Sidon and Tyre and Ashkelon and Babylon and others. It was clear that there was no secondary thing afterwards. They were destroyed. They never been, some were built, some weren't. The ones that were not rebuilt, they stayed that way. But there was no antitype. That was it. That was done. But when we're talking about Israel and when we are talking about the church, there is a bit of duality that we're going to deal with. And this is one of those times. Okay? It's interesting to note, by the way, that this part of Daniel, starting here in chapter 8, the book is now written in Hebrew originally again. Okay? We talked about this before. Chapters 2 through 7, actually most of chapter 2 through chapter 7 was written in Aramaic. Why? Because the emphasis in those chapters was on the Gentile kingdoms in history and prophecy. Now it's back into Hebrew because the nation of Israel is being dealt with. What's happening to Israel. And as we read this chapter, you're going to see exactly what God was talking about. Because remember, the Jews are the chosen people. Through the Jews, Christ came. Thus, salvation is of the Jews, as it says in John 4. So, Daniel's going to have another vision. We're going to actually read through the whole chapter, then go back, because this is one of those chapters you have to jump back and forth. So let's just read the whole thing. Daniel 8, verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after the one that appeared to me the first time. I saw in the vision, and it so happened while I was looking that I was in Shushan, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam. And I saw in the vision that I was by the river Ulai. Then I lifted my eyes and saw, and there, standing beside the river, was a ram, which had 2 horns. And the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. I saw the ram pushing westward, northward, and southward, so that no animal could withstand him, nor was there any that could deliver him from his hand. But he did according to his will and became great. And as I was considering, suddenly a male goat came from the west, across the surface of the whole earth, without touching the ground. And the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. Then he came to the ram that had 2 horns, which I had seen standing beside the river, and ran at him with furious power. And I saw him confronting the ram. He was moved with rage against him, attacked the ram, and broke his 2 horns. There was no power in the ram to withstand him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled him, and there was no one that could deliver the ram from his hand. Therefore the male goat grew very great, but when he became strong, the large horn was broken, and in place of it 4 notable ones came up toward the 4 winds of heaven. And out of the one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. And it grew up to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and some of the stars to the ground and trampled them. He even exalted himself as high as the prince of the host. And by him the daily sacrifices were taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. Because of transgression, an army was given over to the horn to oppose the daily sacrifices, and he cast truth down to the ground. He did all this and prospered. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that certain one who was speaking, "How long will the vision be concerning the daily sacrifices and the transgression of desolation, the giving of both sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot?" And he said to me, "For 2,300 days, then the sanctuary shall be cleansed." Then it happened when I, Daniel, had seen the vision and was seeking the meaning that suddenly there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai, who called and said, "Gabriel, make this man understand the vision." So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was afraid and fell on my face. But he said to me, "Understand, son of man, that the vision refers to the time of the end." Now as he was speaking with me, I was in a deep sleep with my face to the ground. But he touched me and stood me upright. And he said, "Look, I am making known to you what shall happen in the latter time of the indignation. For at the appointed time the end shall be. The ram which you saw having 2 horns, they are the kings of Media and Persia. The male goat is the kingdom of Greece. The large horn that is between his eyes is the first king. As for the broken horn and the 4 that stood up in its place, the 4 kingdoms shall arise out of that nation, but not with its power. And in the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their fullness, a king shall arise, having fierce features, who understands sinister schemes. His power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. He shall destroy fearfully and shall prosper and thrive. He shall destroy the mighty and also the holy people. Through his cunning he shall cause deceit to prosper under his rule, and as he shall exalt himself in his heart, and he shall destroy many in their prosperity. He shall even rise against the Prince of Princes, but he shall be broken without human means. And the vision of the evenings and the mornings which was told is true. Therefore seal up the vision, for it refers to many days in the future. And I, Daniel, fainted and was sick for days. Afterwards I rose and it went about the king's business. I was astonished by the vision, but no one understood it. Okay. Daniel has these visions that really do kind of, you wonder about them sometimes, but you know it's from God. But they're interesting. And this is the thing is that it's all, the visions are symbolic, but the symbolism is clear what he's referring to. Now, we happen to have the benefit of 20/20 hindsight. Looking back in history, we know what these different beasts represent. And Daniel got his interpretation from Gabriel. And yes, this is the same Gabriel who announced the birth of John the Baptist to Zacharias, his father, and the same Gabriel who announced the birth of Christ to Mary. Okay? Gabriel gets around quite a bit. All right? Now, this vision took place about 2 years after the first one that, remember, Daniel had in chapter 7. So the year is about 551 BC. And this time, what's missing is the Roman Empire and the Babylonian Empire. Now, at this point, Babylon has about 12 more years left. So I think God decided, we're not going to deal with Babylon anymore. It's on the way out. You know it's on the way out. No need for me to belabor the point. So as that's why I read the whole thing. Okay, so Gabriel is there. And it seems like Daniel has lots of companions, heavenly companions, when he has these visions. So Daniel is listening to this vision. Now, it's interesting. Now, a lot of people discuss, well, where was he? All right? There are people that says that he was in this town, the city called Shushan. Other translations call it Susa. It's about 200 miles southeast of Babylon, and really wasn't that important. It was a provincial capital. The province was called Elam. At the time, it was controlled by the Medes. Okay, but at that time, it was just a provincial capital. Nothing special about it. Eventually, it became the capital of the Persian Empire. So it's interesting that this goat, or this ram rather, appears here in Shushan. Now, some writers say, he was probably there on some diplomatic mission. That could be. However, remember from Daniel 5, Belshazzar had no clue who Daniel was. In my mind, that means he probably wasn't on a diplomatic mission because the king would have sent him out. And if the king doesn't know this guy, why would he be sending him anywhere? I'm thinking more likely, and there's a lot of commentators who think the same thing, that in his vision, it was like he was heavenly transported to Shushan. Now, this is not unusual. Ezekiel, if you read through the book of Ezekiel was taken away to Babylon, but in the spirit, the Lord transported him back to Jerusalem so he could see what was happening at the temple. And in the book of Revelation, John was transported up into heaven, okay? He was transported to a high mountain, different places. I think this is what was happening here, because there's a reason. Shushan equals Persia. And that ram equals Persia. It makes sense. And this river Ulai is basically a canal that goes in front of the city. It actually provides water to the city. So here's this ram. It has two horns. One's bigger than the other. And we've talked about this before. It's the Persian Empire. Now the Medes and the Persians. It was a joint kingdom, the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians, but in this situation, the Persians were definitely the senior partners. That's why the big one horn is bigger than the other. Remember in chapter 7, you had a bear, which one side was bigger than the other. It was unbalanced. It was an unbalanced kingdom. Okay? So this ram, at the very beginning, as we know, and we went through this last week, it went everywhere. Okay? It went east, almost into India. It went north. It went south. It conquered Egypt. It went toward Greece and basically took out most of the Grecian kingdoms in Asia Minor, which is today's Turkey. If we... Oops. Hold on. There we go. Okay. You might remember seeing this map before. This is the Persian Empire. It just started basically here, okay? And it was for a time allied with Nebuchadnezzar. When Nebuchadnezzar died, I guess they figured the alliance was done. Here's Babylon. Here's Shushan over here. But at the very beginning, the Persian armies were practically invincible. They went everywhere. Here's India. This is the Indus River. Here's Greece. It went into Greece and into all of Asia Minor. And yes, they took over Egypt and, of course, Jerusalem. Okay? Cyrus had his own way. We've talked about Cyrus before, so we don't need to go on more about it. But that's what's being described here. These various animals representing the nations surrounding Persia get defeated and trampled. And the Persian kings decided, there's some issues with the Greeks over in the Greek islands. And there was a lot of these kingdoms over here in Asia Minor, which were thoroughly under the control of Persia. A lot of the Greeks caused trouble here, trying to cause rebellions and revolts. And finally the Persians got sick of it and says, we're going to go over, we're going to take the rest of Greece. Didn't work out too well. This is the first sign of the beginning. Now, before we go much further, before we go on to the next piece in verse 5, let's remember that at this point in time that Daniel is prophesying, the Babylonians probably had never even heard of them. Okay? If we go back to the time of the Babylonian kingdom, the Greeks were just a bunch of little city-states over here throughout this part of Asia Minor and Southern Europe. Okay? You had Athens, you had Sparta. There was great culture there, there was democracy, but a lot of warring among themselves. Okay, the Spartans were especially known as being very devoted warriors. But in Babylon, which is a good 1,000 miles away, the Babylonians never even came in contact with them. They probably had heard of them through intermediaries in Asia Minor, but the bottom line is saying that the Greek Empire was going to overthrow the mighty Persian Empire, which at this point was just starting to get going. It was kind of like saying that El Salvador is going to conquer the world. That sounds ridiculous, but the thing is, at the time, this sounded ridiculous. Okay? And then we go to verse 5. We have disaster coming for Persia. We have this one-horned goat that basically attacks the ram, shatters both the horns, and tramples the ram. Well, as we know, and we've talked about this before, this is Greece, the Empire of Greece. Gabriel tells Daniel that toward the end of the chapter. This is Alexander the Great. In fact, the horn represents Alexander the Great. Okay? He invaded the Persian Empire in 334 BC. Okay? Now we look at this goat. He's described as he's moving so fast that his hooves don't touch the ground, and he charges all the way across the entire Persian Empire. Starting from here, all the way across, then back, and then down, then back again. In 6 years. Wow. This is a notable military achievement. No one had ever seen anything like this happen before. And the Persians, here's the thing. He was angry. Why? Well, during those little wars I was talking about earlier, one of the Persian kings burned Athens, which was very uncharacteristic of the Persians. Persians usually didn't go in for burning cities just for the fun of it, okay, or just because they felt they were bored or that their liver was bothering them. That just didn't happen, okay? So, but he did it. In anger, he did it. He had the city burned. Now, Alexander was from Macedonia. He wasn't from Athens. But to him, the burning of a city like that is a great insult to the inhabitants of the country. So when he invaded Persia, It was for revenge. He was angry with the Persian government. His goal was to exact that same revenge, and which he did. There's a town here called Persepolis that was basically a secondary capital, okay, up in this area here. And he burned it, and later regretted doing it, because it's such a beautiful city. But hey, it's warfare, tit for tat. Now, Greece, of course, as I mentioned, no one would expect such a country to take on the Persian Empire and take him down. And this is actually, there's a symbolism here too. I don't know how much you know about sheep and goats together. I happen to have a sheep and 2 goats, and it's interesting to watch them interact. And I've read often that when you get a ram and a buck is a male goat, together, the fight is very unequal and always in the favor of the ram. Why? Well, it's not so much because the ram is bigger, he is, but because when 2 rams are fighting it out, they go straight head to head like this. A goat, before he rams, he rears up and then comes down, which makes sense. He's using gravity in his favor. But while he's up, the ram can go like that, and that, with such force, can basically severely injure that goat, and that goes out of the fight. This is you see the symbolism here. Greece wasn't expected to win, but he did, okay? He had all the cards in his favor. Part of the problem was that the Persians, the reason the Persians couldn't get any traction over here in Greece, because if you look, it's a bunch of little narrow pieces of land in peninsulas. And the Persian armies, they had these big old lines of archers and spearmen and so on and so forth. This was battle on open ground, or it's made for battle on open ground. There's no open ground here, which is why, even though they stopped the Persians, there were heavy casualties on both sides. But once you got over here, they figured, now you're on your home turf. You can now have these huge, massive engagements that you were trained for. But Alexander was a military genius. He didn't fall for it. He used unorthodox methods, and it got to the point where when Alexander's army was appearing, there was not even a fight because everybody threw up their hands, threw down their weapons, and say, "We give up." Okay? Cities everywhere, Persian cities, like, "We're not going to deal with you. Yeah. Come on in." Jerusalem was like that. Jerusalem, they heard Alexander marching in. Hey, come on in. Got something to tell you, too. And this is from the Talmud, so this is kind of legend. We don't know how true it is. As Alexander marched into Jerusalem, the high priest welcomed him with open arms and showed him passages of the scripture that mentioned him, this one in particular. Now, again, we don't know how true this is, but we do know that he spared Jerusalem and kept going down to Egypt. And again, same thing. Yeah, there's a few battles, but most of the time they said, okay, we'll fight. Okay, uncle, I give up. That's the end of it. All right? The conquest of the Persian Empire, as I said, is amazing. And he would have gone further had he been allowed to. If we look at Alexander's empire, and there's 2 maps here, okay? Alexander's empire crossed the Indus River into India. He would have gone further had his men had not moved on. Okay? He actually went up here into Afghanistan, okay? Armenia, all these areas here, these were all taken by Alexander the Great in a very short amount of time. Now, part of the problem with his army, despite Alexander being this great military leader, he started having delusions of godhood. When he was in Egypt, one of the priesthood there announced that Alexander was descended from Ammon, which was the sun god in Egypt, which was equivalent to Zeus in Greek religion. So now he started thinking, oh, these priests are telling me I'm the son of the highest of the gods. And he started requiring his men to prostrate themselves, not just bow, but get on the ground and face down on the floor before him. Which, by the way, was an Oriental custom that the Persians did out of normal thing. Remember, this is kind of a side note, but you may remember the whole issue between Haman and Mordecai in the book of Esther. Is that Haman wanted Mordecai to bow before him. We're not talking about this type of bow. We're talking about laying face down in front of him like he was a god. And Mordecai would say no. That kind of now puts a little bit more into that story of Esther of what the issue really was. Alexander wanted to basically, even though he conquered the Persians, he wanted them to make them feel like partners or equals. He started putting Persian officers into his officer corps. So Greek men were now being commanded by Persians. He married a Persian princess, a woman by the name of Roxana. She became his queen, and they were fruitful and conceived, shall we say. And they figured he was going to be a boy. Of course, he's Alexander, it better be a boy. And that boy was going to be his heir, even though he is half Greek. Unfortunately, it didn't go according to plan. Because at the height of his power, the goat's power, the large horn was broken. Alexander died at the age of 33 of a sudden illness, a sudden fever that came on and lingered for about 12 days. It was brought on by a bout of drinking. I mean, what happened is his very best friend, one of these, kind of like a David and Jonathan type friend, his very best friend died, and Alexander decided to drown his sorrows. And somewhere down the line, he got sick, and after 12 days, he died of a fever in Babylon. Now, some people say, he was poisoned. Well, at that point in time, they didn't have any poisons that lingered that long. Today, different story. Back then, no. So he died. And, and his heir, now here's where the problem was. His heir hadn't been born yet. It was going to be born. It was there. The muffin was in the oven. It was going to be there. But this left a power vacuum. And this power vacuum, you had the region back here in Greece. They actually kept things going while Alexander was going all over the world, the known world at this point. His regent, Antiochus, tried, successfully held things together. But now that Alexander was dead, as he was trying to hold it together, there were other more or less scrupulous people who wanted power. To make a very long story short, because it is a long story, basically 4 of his generals declared their independence. This yellow section was the original part of what was left of Alexander's empire. The 2 of interest we're interested in, this empire over here in green, this was taken over by a general by the name of Seleucus. And purple down here, Ptolemy. And when this section was finally crushed, they kind of split the spoils between them. This empire became the largest one. It actually took over most of this area, though Egypt took this area down here. These two empires are going to figure prominently in our discussion that follows. So, we now see, and by the way, this is something that this prophecy refers to the breakup of Alexander's empire. All Bible scholars, secular as well as conservative, agree on this point. There is no disagreement that this one horn breaking into 4 is referring to this event of the breakup of Alexander's empire. Okay? So keep that in mind. There's no argument here. So now, as we read on, there is a small horn that comes up in one of the other ones. And the small horn is going to rise from this empire here, the Seleucid Empire. And now I'm going to introduce you to a fellow by the name of Antiochus IV, who also went by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes. He was king of that Green Empire, that Seleucid Empire, between 175 and 163 BC. Basically 8 years. Okay, 12 years, excuse me. This man, despite his name, this man is one of the most ruthless and capricious potentates of the ancient world. Okay? He did things, literally did horrible things on a whim because he was bored, because he wanted his way. He wasn't a Nebuchadnezzar that thought through what he needed to do. I mean, he started out life simple enough. Okay, he started out as a small horn. How? Well, he was the second son of Antiochus III. Okay, and this king happened to lose a battle to the Romans a few years before or a few years after Antiochus' birth, and because Antiochus was in the line of succession, he spent a good portion of his childhood in Rome as a political hostage. Basically, remember, that's why Daniel was in Babylon. He was a political hostage. All right? Well, when his father died, his brother ascended to the throne, and now he was out of the line of succession directly, so he was released as a hostage, and his nephew was taken as a hostage. It's all complex. But then his brother died. Now, in the normal Greek law, the son was supposed to take over. But because the son was a hostage, Antiochus decided he's going to take advantage of this. And he goes from Athens, which is where he was staying, down here to Antioch, which was where the capital was at that time, and basically usurped his brother's throne. And he managed to buy off enough of the nobility in that part of the world as they supported him, and there was no way his brother could challenge him. And he died 5 years later. A lot of people think that he was assassinated, but there's no proof. So once he's on the throne, he begins calling himself Antiochus Epiphanes. Now this word Epiphanes means the illustrious one, or God manifest. Delusions of Godhead, I think. He started printing his coins with the word theos on it. God. Theos means God in Greek. And on the coins, as time went on, his picture looked less and less like Antiochus and more like Zeus, but was still identified as Antiochus. And he was and the term capricious, by the way, in case you don't know what it means that he could change his mind at will. Very unpredictable. He was very generous. He would go down into the cities and he would throw money literally over the street and then go on and take some more money, throw it on a different street. And, people thought about that. And he would give expensive gifts to people he didn't know. He would even apply to run for municipal offices. He was the king. But he would apply to run for municipal offices to see what people would do. Okay? As a result, there was a play on words. A lot of people started calling him Epiphanes, which is a play on words. Epiphanes. Epiphanes means the mad one. Okay? Even though he was supposedly devoted to Zeus, he did a lot of things that would, in terms of his devotion, that were very blasphemous, even in Greek eyes. Okay? So, what happened? Okay? Well, let's move in on the part here. This is Jerusalem. Up here, we have the Seleucid Empire. There's no borders since it changed. Here's the Ptolemy Empire in Egypt. Antiochus decides he wants to conquer Egypt. Why? Because it's a valuable land. It is the breadbasket of the Mediterranean, so therefore, whoever controls Egypt controls a lot of power in the Mediterranean. So he goes down and conquers them. Okay? However, he also knows that there is another up-and-coming power in the Mediterranean, the Roman Republic. And he had already fought, his dad had fought a war and lost, and the Romans were right on his back doorstep, and they were not happy with him. So even though he conquered Egypt, he withdrew. He kept the king there, but kept him as a puppet. Okay? And then went back and kind of apologized to Rome for what he did. Now, during this time, he had conquered this entire region around Jerusalem, Judea, it is now known. Judah was the old name. The Greek name was Judea. Okay? So he goes and he begins, and here's the thing, unlike most Greek monarchs, up to this point in time, the Greeks were very much in favor of freedom of religion. They never pushed their religion on any of the conquered people, including the Jews. So up to this point in time, under the rule of Egypt, the Greek rulers of Egypt, Jerusalem was fine. Judea was fine. The temple sacrifices went on, the rebuilt temple. The Jews were able to practice their religion freely. But now Antiochus took over. And he begins to start pushing for what's referred to as Hellenization. The pushing of Greek culture upon a non-Greek culture. Okay? One of his first acts was to drive out a faithful Hebrew high priest and placed a Jewish or a Greek-speaking high priest, a fellow by the name of Jason, and then started to say, no, you need to change your religious ways more and make them more Greek. Okay? But Jason then got replaced by another fellow by the name of Menelaus, who actually had purchased the priesthood, and when he became high priest, he started plundering the temple to pay off his debts because of all the money he spent. Now, in the meantime, Rome basically said, this isn't going to happen again. And so Antiochus decides to invade Egypt a second time, this time for keeps. He's not going to let them stay independent. Right about here, as he's approaching Alexandria, Egypt, his army is marching, and there is one person standing in the way. This one person is a Roman ambassador by the name of Gaius Linnaeus. He's just standing there with his walking stick. Of course, they recognize him as a Roman. Romans had a particular dress that everyone recognized. Antiochus came up to him and says, what can I do for you? And he said, withdraw your armies. You sent an attack force against Cyprus. You sent an attack force against Egypt. Withdraw your armies, or you will be at war with Rome. And Antiochus, even though he's one guy, Antiochus knows, I'm in trouble. But he decides he's going to play for time. He's done this before, where let's negotiate so I can get some of my goals, and then we'll go by. He says, okay, I'll discuss it with my council, and I'll get back to you next week. And the envoy took his stick and drew a circle in the sand around Antiochus. And by the way, this is the origin of the saying, drawing a line in the sand. Okay? And he said to Antiochus, before you leave this circle, give me a reply that I can take back to the Roman Senate. Essentially saying that if you stepped out of that circle with the wrong answer, we're at war. So Antiochus wasn't a stupid idiot other than this one. He weighed his options, and they weren't many, because he knew, okay, if there's war, I'm going to lose. He said, okay, you win. We're withdrawing. And he did. And he came back, and he was angrier than anything. And as he approached Jerusalem, someone gave him a false rumor that the Jews had supported the Egyptians, and it was false. I mean, and then there was no way it was true. They had the evidence that it wasn't true. Antiochus said, forget it, I'm not going to do it. He sent one of his generals to attack Jerusalem on the Sabbath. 20,000 men marched on the city. Approximately 40,000 men, women, and children were killed. The estimates can go as high as 100,000, and about 20 to 40,000 were taken into slavery. And at that point, Antiochus shows up. He issues an edict that there was only be one religion in his realm, and it wouldn't be Judaism. And he prohibited the Jews from honoring the Sabbath, from practicing circumcision, and obeying the dietary laws. And then, in 168 BC, on December 14th, he erected an image of Zeus in the Jewish temple, in the Holy of Holies, by the way, then sacrificed a pig on the Jewish altar. That desecrated it. Oh, there's more. He then took the flesh, cooked it, and forced the high priests to eat it. This became known to the Jews as the abomination of desolation. This is the type at this point. This is when we read in Matthew 24. It's talking about Jesus is saying the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet. This is it. But this is only a type, because there's more to this prophecy. And there's more here. I mean, this guy knew no bounds. Even his own men started becoming uncomfortable with him. If any Jew was found possessing a copy of the law of Moses, he was brutally slain, and in violation of Greek law and Greek religious practices, those people were sacrificed to Zeus. And like I said, Antiochus' own men were disgusted with him at this point, because to the Greeks, one, human sacrifice is a big no-no, and two, that was barbaric. And we are not barbarians, we are Greeks. We don't play that game. Okay? What happened? Well, that basically tipped the previously compliant Jews to saying, no more. We're done here. This is the beginning of what we read of as the Maccabean revolt. Within 3 years, the Seleucids were kicked out of Jerusalem, and the temple was cleansed. And by the way, this is where the Jewish celebration of Hanukkah was established, was the cleansing of the temple. Okay? Now, fortunately for the Jews, the empires on the eastern side of the Seleucids took advantage of his preoccupation and began invading. In fact, the Parthians, this large purple area here, went up and established a kingdom in Armenia that basically split the empire in two. Well, Antiochus recognized the threat, but he didn't want to get rid of he didn't want to give up Judea. He wanted to make his point. So he left one of his commanders in charge to deal with the Maccabees, who failed miserably, by the way. He went back to face the Parthians, and within a year, he was dead of disease. Okay? And from that point, the empire quickly disintegrated. This last portion here became the Roman province of Syria in 63 BC. That was the end of that. Within 100 years, this all went down. Now, this illness, okay, mentioned not by the hand of man. That's what the prophecy says here in Daniel 9. Well, basically, according to different sources, no one's quite sure, but at one point, Antiochus was trying to raid a temple in one of these towns that had been invaded. And he heard the news of what was happening in Judea. And he basically lost his head. He started uttering threats of reprisals. And suddenly he was seized with severe abdominal pains. They were so bad as he was trying to ride his chariot, he fell off. And he died of a mixture of his injuries and worms in his bowels. Obviously, man had nothing to do with that. And the tradition states that he died imploring the God of Israel to save his life. I don't think so. All the stories agree, though, he died of a disease. No man killed him. He was never assassinated. Now, we took a long time to discuss this Antiochus. You may say, why do we care? What's so important about him? Well, because he's that little horn here that came out from one of the four horns. Okay? He started small, as we saw. He gradually accumulated power, and then he dealt ruthlessly with the Jews. Now, in this passage, Judea is referred to as the glorious land, or depending on your translation, it's also referred to as the beautiful land. And he put a stop to their religious practices. He claimed that he was a god. Now, notice as you're reading through that prophecy, in verse 10, we encounter the remarkable statement that he's going to grow up to the host of heaven and will throw some of the starry host down to earth, where he will trample on them. Now, what's that talking about? Well, the Hebrew word that's translated as host is a term that we most see applied in the Old Testament to the Lord of hosts, or Lord of angel armies, like one of the last songs we sang. Okay? But it is also used of the people of God, because Abraham was promised that his people would be more numerous than the stars of heaven. And the people of Israel, or the God's people, have been described as stars in several places and are spoken of as in the Lord's divisions, or the Lord's hosts. Okay? Daniel 12, just to look ahead, states that true believers, those who are wise, will shine like the brightest of the heavens forever and ever. Now, that's what gives us the basis of that interpretation that he's talking about the people of Israel. And let's face it, this Greek tyrant, I don't care how powerful he is, he can hardly affect either the angels of heaven or the literal stars of the sky. He's not that powerful. Okay? So it must refer to the Jewish believers who's going to join in defending their faith and liberty at this point in time. He's going to cut down and destroy many of the Jews during the time of the tribulation he'll bring on them and have them trampled on them, which is indeed what happened. He stopped the sacrifices in the temple, substituted pagan worship, thus the term abomination of desolation. Okay? What we have here, however, is a type. There is an antitype. There is a second part of this that's going to be fulfilled. Okay? What Antiochus did was a foreshadowing of what the Antichrist is going to do in our future when he puts his image in a temple in Jerusalem and commands the world to worship him. We talked about this last week, and we're going to talk about this more in the coming chapters. So basically, Antiochus is a type, Antichrist is the antitype. There's two different things going on here. Now, there's timing issues, but fortunately, the timing issues are not hard to get around. An angel or a holy one is asked, okay, how long is this going to take place? How long is this desolation going to happen? He's given the number 2,300 days, or 2,300 days. Now, there's a question here. What are we talking about? Okay? The 2,300 days, by the way, that number has been misused so often by people who fancy themselves scholars of prophecy, usually in trying to attempt to tell us when Christ is going to return. He's going to return in 2,300 years, or 2,300 days, or 2,300 eons, or some such thing. And that's not what this is talking about. The Hebrew text actually reads 2,300 evenings and mornings. And it's referring to that because the sacrifices were done in the morning and at night, in the evening. So the question is this 2,300 days? Or is it 1,150 days, which is 2,300 divided by 2? It works either way. It's kind of interesting. Okay? We don't know when Antiochus began to shut down the sacrifices. Okay, remember, he invaded ahead of time. 2,300 days is 6 years and 111 days, which happens to be when he invaded and took over Jerusalem to when the temple was cleansed. 6 years, 111 days. Okay, and this is using the Babylonian or the Jewish calendar of 360 days per year. Okay. But on the other hand, 3 years, 55 days, well, that's when the pig was sacrificed. That's when the temple was invaded. The pig was sacrificed. And it was about 3 years, 55 days until the temple was finally cleansed by the Maccabees. So either way works. Some people try to point at that, and some people try to spiritualize and say it's in the future, or we're looking at this, and what have you. Don't worry about it. It's covered both ways. Okay? There is more, by the way. We know that Antiochus, first off, was not a king of fierce countenance. Okay? That is referring to the Antichrist. But you're going to see parallel characteristics. For example, we're talking about Antiochus and the Antichrist, both began modestly but increased in power and influence. Both blaspheme God with their mouths and speak great things. Okay? Both persecute the Jewish people. Both claim to be gods and put images in the temple. And in Antiochus' case, he fancied himself Zeus, so it's almost like he was saying, worship me. Both impose their own religion on the people. Both are opposed by a believing remnant that knows God. Both are energized by the devil and are great deceivers. I cannot explain any other reason why Antiochus acted the way he did. Okay? Both appear to succeed marvelously and to be invincible, and at the time it did, but both are finally defeated by the coming of a Redeemer. In the case of Antiochus, it was Judas Maccabees. In the case of the Antichrist, it's Jesus Christ. Okay? This is where like I said, there's a lot of debate here. A lot of people say, it's the same. They're talking about the Antichrist, not Antiochus. It's interesting. I watched a YouTube video about this, and it was interesting. You read the comments, and some guy was going off on the person who made the video, i.e. David Guzik, who, as we all know, is a great pastor, and really on top of this. No, that's the Antichrist, and here's why. And he started throwing all the numbers out. It's like, no, he's not. Even the secular scholars agree this is not the same guy. Okay, it represents a type and an antitype, but it's not the same guy. We're going to read more about these guys later, about both the Antichrist and Antiochus Epiphanes. It's interesting. Daniel 8 closes. Gabriel's basically saying, look, this is what it all means. Okay? Now, just tuck it away. Don't reveal it to anybody. And I can understand why, because I'll be honest with you, back then people had no understanding of what it was about. And it's interesting about Daniel's reaction to it. He was faint. He was sick for several days. And then he went back to the king's service, but he still was wondering about it. Because again, what was going to happen to his people? They had already been through a lot. Why did they have to go through more? Okay? As I said, we're going to look more at Antiochus as time goes on, because he is a good picture of the Antichrist. Starts out even keel, popular among the people, and then he shows his true colors. And again, it's interesting to note when a person has actually had a prophetic revelation, they're not out there telling people, I cracked the code, I know what's happening, I'm wonderful, I'm brilliant. They're sick. They are sick because it has affected them so emotionally, they have to just basically, okay, Lord, I got to process this. And when God tells you, keep it under your hat, okay, I will. And I'm sure that had a lot of stress to it. It's like, I need to talk this out with somebody. Of course, he didn't know who. He couldn't tell anybody. But it's one of those things that's just like, no. Lord, you know what's going to happen. We don't need to dwell on it. We need to be aware of it. That's why we're studying this stuff. We're aware of what our future is going to look like, the signs of the end. Not to be fearful, not to worry about what's going to happen, just to make it clear that we have to spread the word to our neighbors, because we don't want them left behind in something like this. I got news for you. I don't care after the rapture when the Antichrist takes over, I don't care if you're what member of what church you are. Unless you fall in line with him, you're dead meat. And those people who die without the Lord thinking that they have the truth and are deceived, they're no better off than the ones that take the mark. That's why we have to reach our friends and neighbors and let them know the time is short. But next week, another prophecy? No, next week we get to read the prayer of Daniel. And this is another way to respond to prophecy that all of us should emulate. Lord, come quickly. Father, we thank you again for this time we've had together. And we ask you now to continue to reveal what is in this book, what is in these prophecies that affect us, and then not to be fearful, but to spread the word, to reach out to those that need your love. You continue to use us as a lighthouse in the darkened area. Draw people closer to us so we can point them to you. Draw them to you, Father, so we can give them the word, the straightforward, simple word of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Father, as we finish up today, we ask you to bless our time. Be with those who are sick today, Father. Keep us safe here as we, without any back injuries or anything, as we clean up. And give us safe passage home today. We praise you now, Father. We thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.